Imagine a city where the church spires pierce the gray sky like spears, and the streets below are so narrow that neighbors can shake hands from their bedroom windows. This is York. In the 1500s, a place of immense power, holy rebellion, and unholy stench, where a single decision by a king in London could leave bodies hanging from the tower walls. To truly understand life in the 1500s, you have to strip away the romantic image of merry old England and step into the mud. If you were dropped into York at the turn of the 16th century, the first thing to assault you would not be the sight of the magnificent minster. It would be the smell. York was the capital of the north, the second most important city in the entire kingdom, but it was also a medieval pressure cooker, tightly corseted inside ancient Roman and Viking walls. The population was crammed into a space barely larger than a modern university campus, creating a density we can barely imagine today. The streets, known locally as snickelways, were less like roads and more like open sewers. Sanitation was non-existent. No underground plumbing, only open gutters running down the center of the cobblestones. The muck was so legendary that the city corporation actually had to pass a specific act of parliament in 1532 just to get the main streets paved, because carts were literally being swallowed whole by the mud. The architecture reflected this chaotic density. People lived in jettied, timber-framed houses, the kind you can still see in York today. These were not built this way for style. They were a tax evasion strategy and a space-saving necessity. By building the second floor to stick out over the first, and the third over the second, you maximized floor space without paying for a larger street footprint. But this turned the streets into dark, damp tunnels where sunlight rarely touched the ground. In the famous Shambles, the butcher's quarter, the houses leaned so close together, they nearly touched at the roofline. Here, the sensory overload was at its peak. Butchers displayed meat on open shelves called fleshboards. Slaughter happened right there in the shop. The floors were slanted so that blood could be swept directly into the street, where it was cleaned up by the city's unofficial sanitation workers. The pigs, herds of swine roamed free, rooting through the midden heaps, piles of household waste that residents simply dumped outside their front doors. Yet amidst this squalor, there was a sophisticated infrastructure of community and faith. The city was dominated by the River Ouse, the superhighway of the era, bringing in wool, wine, and spices from across the known world. Crossing it was the bridge, a marvel of medieval engineering so crowded it looked like a small town floating on water. It did not just carry traffic. It held shops, a council chamber, a prison for debtors and kidnappers, and even a chapel, St. William's Chapel, all piled precariously onto stone arches. Above the rushing river, life here was loud and communal. Privacy was a foreign concept. With thin wattle and daub walls, you knew every detail of your neighbor's life. Your social status, your hobby, and your safety net were all tied to the guild's powerful associations of craftsmen like the merchant, adventurers, and looming over it all was the church. York was a fiercely Catholic city, with over 40 parish churches crammed within the walls. The bells rang constantly, marking the hours, the masses, and the curfews. This religious devotion was the glue that held the filthy, vibrant city together. But as the 1530s approached, that same devotion was about to trigger the most violent and defining event in the city's entire history. The religious devotion that defined York would ultimately become its greatest danger, leading to the single most catastrophic event of the century, the Pilgrimage of Grace. Understand the magnitude of this, you have to understand that York was not just a city of churches. It was an ecclesiastical powerhouse. The skyline was dominated not just by the minster, but by St. Mary's Abbey, the richest and most powerful monastery in the north of England. The monks were the city's biggest employers, its landlords, and its welfare system. So, when Henry VIII decided to break from Rome and began the dissolution of the monasteries, he was not just changing a religion. He was destroying York's entire economy and social fabric. The people of York did not take this lying down. In October of 1536, a lawyer named Robert Aske led a massive uprising. This was not a mob of peasants with pitchforks. This was a disciplined army of 30,000 people, including lords and knights, marching under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. They did not have to lay siege to York. The city threw open its gates and welcomed them. For a brief, intoxicating moment, York was the capital of a free Catholic North, standing in open defiance of the Tudor king in London. But the hope was short-lived, and the retribution was brutal. Henry VIII played a cunning game. He promised pardon. He promised a parliament in York. He dispersed the rebel army with sweet words and then turned around and crushed them the moment they had gone home. The crackdown transformed the city's atmosphere from pious celebration to paranoid fear overnight. Robert Aske, the leader who had been welcomed as a hero, was dragged back to York in chains. On a sweltering day in July 1537, he was brought to Clifford's Tower, the castle keep that still stands today, and hung in chains from the walls. Unlike a standard hanging, this was a slow, agonizing death designed to send a message to every citizen watching from below. The North had been broken, but the king did not stop at executions. He proceeded to physically dismantle the city's infrastructure. The great St. Mary's Abbey was seized, its roof stripped of lead, its stone quarried to build administrative offices. The library filled with centuries of irreplaceable knowledge was destroyed. The monks were cast out into the streets. With the monasteries gone, the entire safety net for the poor collapsed. Vagrancy surged. Desperate poverty gripped the city. The guild system cracked under the weight. To ensure York never rebelled again, Henry established the Council of the North, taking over the abbot's house, now known as the King's Manor, and turned York into a government town. The city became the administrative headquarters for the entire north of England. The soul of the medieval city had been ripped out. The grand processions of the mystery plays were suppressed, seen as too Catholic, and the colorful, chaotic, holy city began to turn gray. The 1500s in York started with the ringing of bells and the chanting of monks. But the middle of the century was defined by the sound of falling masonry and the silence of a population terrified to speak against the king as the 1500s drew to a close. Under the reign of Elizabeth I, York had transformed entirely, from a loud, open, religious carnival into a city of secrets and spies. The Council of the North had turned it into a mini London, a hub for lawyers and gentry. But beneath the surface, a dangerous game of cat and mouse was being played. While the public face of York was now strictly Protestant, the old faith had not vanished. It had just gone underground. This era gave birth to one of York's most harrowing stories, that of Margaret Clitherow, the Pearl of York. A butcher's wife living on the Shambles, she secretly hid Catholic priests in a purpose-built chamber in her attic. In 1586, she was caught. Her execution was not a quick beheading. To avoid implicating her children, she refused to plead. And the law had a terrible answer for that. She was laid on the ground with a sharp rock beneath her back. A door loaded with 700 pounds of weight was placed on top of her until she was crushed. Her house on the Shambles is still a shrine today, a dark reminder that the golden age of Elizabeth was a time of terror for many in the North. The cultural heartbeat of the city was also forcibly changed. For centuries, the York Mystery Plays had been the city's pride, a massive community effort, involving every guild telling the entire Bible story in the streets. But the Protestant authorities viewed these plays as popish superstition. In 1569, the unthinkable happened. The plays were suppressed for the final time in the century. The vibrant street theater that had defined York's identity for generations was silenced. Life became less about public ritual and more about private vice. Alehouses were booming. Drinking was the favorite pastime of all classes. largely because small beer was safer than the water. For the wealthy merchants dining in the magnificent Merchant Adventurers Hall, life was comfortable. They feasted on roasted peacock and imported wines. For the poor, entertainment was brutal bear baiting and cockfighting, gambling crowds near the castle. And then nature itself struck. In 1564, a catastrophic winter flood surged down the river Ouse. The ice and water smashed into the famous bridge, sweeping away the central 2 arches, 12 houses, and 12 lives. It severed the city in 2. Rebuilding it took years and nearly bankrupted the corporation, forcing them to beg for money from across the country. By the time the clock struck midnight on December 31st, 1599, York was unrecognizable from the city of 1500. It had lost its abbeys, lost its plays, lost its independence to the crown's bureaucrats. The wool trade, once the source of its immense wealth, was dying. As commerce moved to the west, riding towns of Leeds and Halifax, York ended the century not as a manufacturing powerhouse but as a genteel administrative capital, a city of lawyers, ruins, and ghosts, waiting for a new identity to emerge from the shadows of the past.